I think we can start. We will still wait for more people eventually to join. So I'll just start very briefly to introduce the panelists today. Let me just see here. All right. So today we will have Mark Dekker, a researcher at PBL in University of Utrecht. Mark has been a researcher there and a postdoc as well. He has expertise in integrated assessment modeling and the evaluation of mitigation effort sharing frameworks and fairness considerations into scenario analysis. So today he's going to present his paper that was published in Nature Climate Change this year, called Navigating the Black Box of Fair National Emission Targets. And we will have Nico Bauer then discussing his paper. Nico Bauer is a senior scientist at PEAK. His work focused mainly on the development of modeling, integrated assessment modeling tools and scenarios, and he has a long list of publication, very good published, very well published. He's very well published, and he's responsible for the cross-cut group of scenario feasibility of energy, land use, and economic transformation pathways and related policies at PEAK. Just before we start, a very few housekeeping rules. So you can use the raise your hand feature, but you can also, and please do so, post your questions in the Q&A box, and we will try to address those at the end, during the discussion at the end, when after Nico has discussed. The seminar will be recorded, so please, in case you have any objection to that, yeah, just don't participate in that case. Apologies for this. And this will be the last webinar series of the New Pathways project for this year. We will come to you with new webinars for next year. Thank you very much. With this, I would pass the floor completely to Mark, and you can start. Thanks, Mark, for being here.
Thanks a lot, Lara, and thanks a lot, everyone, for joining this discussion of this paper. And of course, it's an interesting title where we say navigating the black box of fair national emissions targets, which you may make you wonder, why do we call it a black box? Yeah, well, you will see in due time, I guess, over this presentation. But the main point of, I guess, the paper itself already is that national emission targets to be called fair, that's actually not, there's no single clear answer to that. There are many different choices that you can make, and there are piles and papers of literature on this topic, on what national emission target should be called fair, or how far or how deep a certain emission target should become fair. It's super relevant for negotiations, for of course, also law and court cases. But yeah, it's very difficult to pinpoint single targets for countries. And that is why we call it a black box, because a lot of papers make different decisions on this. And what we try to do in this paper is not only simply updating fair national emission targets and looking at implications and stuff, but mostly also making transparent that there are different choices on this, and maybe not even exhaustive or comprehensive in this paper, maybe even beyond this paper, that you can make on this. And that is why we call it a black box. And we try to, throughout this presentation and the paper, unpeel this black box a little bit. Okay, so let me set the stage first. Let me see if this works. Yeah. A couple of weeks ago, we had the COP in Belém. And they were discussing, well, partially what was of course very present there are the new NDC updates for 2035. And of course, what would be a fair target or a good target for countries or a good ambition for countries is part of that question. And it is in the background, in a context of emissions that are ever rising. This is from a very recent report, or the UNEP-GAP report this year, that indeed in 2024 emissions are still rising. So somehow we need to go from this very high emissions down to reach global targets. And you have these global pathways being generated. This is a figure from our paper. You have huge models trying to compute pathways from the current state of, or in this case, 2021 downwards. And for example, if you then look at 2030, there are certain reduction fractions associated with it. So let's, for example, now focus on if we want to together reach a global target of, say, 1.5 degree. Then in 2030, the globe has to have reduced, and of course there is uncertainty on that, but say on the order of 56% GHG reduction. Or for 1.6, where you say allow a very small overshoot, a 40% reduction. Then the question is, of course, this is global. How does this boil down to countries? Which countries should do more than the 40% and which countries should do less? Or should we somehow divide that everybody does 40%? There are also people saying that. And this is exactly the core of what we will be talking about today. How do we distribute this, mitigation burden or effort across countries? And it's not as simple as simply looking at the models that even generated these pathways and asking them to give us an answer, because that is an answer that that has certain normative implications in itself. And there are models behind this. For the scientists among us, there are databases of 1,200 of scenario projections towards the future, and some of them are indeed Paris aligned or going in the direction of the temperature targets that we were just now talking about. But if you ask those models, show your regional output, you will see that they project for example, the EU and North America, that they would invest much lower as a fraction of their GDP in mitigation than, for example, in Middle East or Africa. And this is one of the figures hinting towards that. In other words, the models themselves, they have a global cost optimal, have what is the cheapest for the globe perspective, which is definitely not always in line with what would be a fair perspective to do this distribution. So that is why there have been papers already for decades trying to answer the question outside of these models necessarily of linking the global targets that we set together at these COPs to what would be national targets for countries, but then in a fair manner, apart from what is a cost optimal manner. And later we will make the comparison between the two. So spoiler alert for that. So how do you do this then? How do these other papers do that? And also, how do we do that? This is links to each other. It could start with a graph like this from the SPM AR6, where you have cumulative emissions on the horizontal and temperature on the vertical, which has this super nice, almost linear relation between the two. And you can infer what was back then when this figure was generated, the historical warming. Actually, we spent quite a lot already since. And then you can infer what would be the remaining carbon budget, so the amount of cumulative CO2 emissions left in order to remain within a certain climate target. In this case, it is estimated recently also to be around 130 gigatons for the 1.5, which is very, very thin. And of course, it becomes larger if you allow overshoot or other climate targets. But this is just an example. And this is then a way of doing this sharing. So saying who should do more or what is basically, we have a total pie of this remaining carbon budget. And this is the thing we can then cut up in pieces for the different countries. Another perspective would be these emissions pathways, where I referred to at the start of this presentation, had this 40%, if you may recall. So which countries should do more, which countries should do less. You can also think about sharing investments, which is not on the emission side, but more on the monetary side. And there are also papers doing combinations of things, for example, related here, a paper where they take the net zero year or a fair net zero year as kind of a calibration point, and then compute what would be a carbon credit or a carbon debt, which then outside of domestic emissions needs to be resolved. So also already on that level, there are different approaches to this problem. But they all share the same, say, fundamental question. Whether you focus on finance to be shared, whether you focus on missions to be shared, they also all have one fundamental question, namely, what is the basis? More like the ethical slash philosophical basis by which you do this sharing. And there are also many answers to this, but let's dive into something we share with many countries, which is agreed upon with many countries, namely UNFCCC. And then Article 3 says the following. And there are a couple of elements that I would like to pick out to give you a taste of, and this text is used a lot to support this literature, to give you a bit of taste of what are kind of the foundational elements to do this sharing. And I want to basically read it through together. So on the top left, it says the party should protect the climate system for the benefit of present and future generations. And that already says something about intergenerational. So it's not only about now, it could also be about the future and about generations in history. Of humankind, on the basis of equity and in accordance with their common but differentiated responsibilities, which is a very important part, which basically says, this 40%, remember from the start of this presentation, everybody doing 40% is not a differentiated responsibility. So there is that literally in UNFCCC. And then it says, and respective capabilities. So that says something about that there are nations that have more capability than others should then take the lead. Now, accordingly, the developed country party should take the lead in combating climate change and the adverse effects thereof. So that's also something that's explicitly mentioned there, the developed countries. Let's keep these 4 elements in mind when looking at this pentagon, which are basically general principles by which you can do this sharing. We call them allocation principles. You can call them whatever you want. 2 of them out of here are directly related to what we just read, right? So responsibility, focusing on the polluter pays. So basically a principle by which you account for that there are some countries that simply did historically a lot more emissions than other countries. So there are some countries that basically created the problem more than others, and that should be weighted in. So that's responsibility. And then you have capability that says something like that there are some countries that have more capability in terms of, for example, wealth, but could also be, if you want to expand it, in terms of like institutions and stuff, more the capability to do mitigation, and therefore should also do more. So those could be regarded fair. And then there's a third that is sometimes added as a fairness principle, but that is contested. It's better than basically saying everybody should do 40%, which is continuity, by the way, in this diagram. Equality says something like that every person on Earth gets a little carbon budget, which sounds maybe fair, and to some extent maybe is. But because of these hugely unequal responsibilities and capabilities, it is sometimes regarded really as a second rank principle. And then we have cost optimality, which is again the one that we saw also at the start of this presentation, which is coming out from models. It's interesting to look at. You learn a lot from the system, from cost optimal differentiations, but it's not necessarily something that teaches us something about fairness. And then, so these are abstract principles. And then there is the exercise of translating these general, maybe philosophical principles into actual mathematical equations. And here is a couple of them, most of them, all of them actually we included in our paper, but there are even more outside of this in the literature to be found. that are actually giving numbers to these principles. And you already get a feeling when talking about this that there are discussions and uncertainties or different choices to be made. There are different ways by which you can model responsibility, for example. And this is good to keep in mind for later. So we have this shared basis now, and we now are translating this to a couple of numbers, focusing on three of these aspects: the equality, the responsibility, and the capability, and rules that were associated with them. So I want to show a couple of numbers just to give you a taste of what are then the fair shares. Remember this 40%, because that's the kind of the this 1.6 pathway, so 1.5 with a small overshoot, is what we took as kind of the reference, what we wanted to share among the countries in the graphs that you will be seeing. So anything larger than the 40% for 2030 is countries that do more than kind of the average. So that's maybe the reference point for you. Oh yeah, so that's this graph again. So remember, we are focusing on the pathway that's associated with that, and specifically for 2030, that's then the 40% reduction as a median. So, for example, the US over here, you see at the top, you see emissions over time indexed at 2021. And at the bottom, you see allocations in 2030. So basically a snap slice of the top figure for only 2030. Also of reductions with respect to 2021. And you see that the US has to do more than this 40%, obviously. Equality is in blue. The capability-related rule is in yellow. And you see that in the legend at the bottom. And purple indicates a rule that weighs in responsibility, so historical emissions. And you see that especially that latter one weighs heavily on the US because in 2021 already, the US has spent its fair budget basically already. So it's in carbon debt, you could call it. And that is why you see this downward bulge. So it has to pay off the debt first before continuing on. That's what you see in the time allocations over time. You see the same in Europe. More than 40% in 2030. And again, also the historical responsibility weighing heavy on the EU. For India, you see actually the opposite. So you see that they, compared to their population in the past, they have emitted relatively little, and therefore get allocated very much by when weighing in responsibility. And for China, it's at least in terms of the medians or the default results, which are these diamonds at the bottom. It's around equal, these three rules. So that's also interesting to see. But their ambition, which is the NDC in green, is way above any fair target for China. And here I have Nigeria and Brazil also as examples. In Nigeria, for example, you see that they actually have to reduce barely anything or can even increase a lot, depending on the allocation rule, if you factor in fairness for mitigation. So you can do this country by country, but you can also say, let's try to summarize what would be now the most favorable out of these three principles per country. And you can do that nicely in a figure like this, where on the horizontal, you have GDP per capita. And on the vertical, you have historical emissions per capita. Every country is a dot here, population size in dot size. And the color of each of the dots indicates what is the least stringent or given the most in 2030 for that respective country. And then you see that the countries to the top right, which are the past polluters, so a lot of historical emissions per capita, but also the rich, get allocated most through this equality, which is this contested fairness principle. And then you have in the middle a lot of countries that are allocated a lot through capability, or most through capability. And then you have responsibility to the bottom right, bottom left, which already suggests this almost segregation of the bullets here already suggests that it's highly political, right? And we knew that up front, but it's interesting to see this clear separation of countries already in what favors whom, and it becomes even more difficult if you include all other kinds of uncertainties, not only this one between what principle should you follow, which is a major one, obviously, but there are many other uncertainties related to how you actually quantify each of these numbers. And that is something I want to address now, which is also a major part of the paper. So there are a couple of uncertainty sources, or uncertainty is maybe not the right word, but assumptions and choices related to this type of work. And one is related to scope, one category of choices. Many papers that focus on fair shares or emission targets focus on mitigation only. But in negotiations, you'll hear a lot about loss and damage and adaptation that should somehow be part of this equation as well. We did not focus on costs, and a lot of literature not with us. But of course, costs of mitigation vary a lot over the world, but also cost of capital and cost of investments. But also, do you include the agricultural sector, for example? Is that something that you want to include here, or is that so regionally bound that you separate it off? So there are all kinds of scoping questions that may differ, but may also affect the results that you just saw. Right? There are normative questions related to, of course, the one we just saw about the colors of the bullets. What is most favorable, or which allocation rule do you find fair? That is a normative question. And maybe how do you weigh them if you would want to do some kind of weighing algorithm? How do you factor in historical emissions? Do you go all the way back to 1850, or only back to Paris or the UNFCCC 1990? Those are normative choices to some extent. And do you discount historical emissions? And so basically, because say CO2 being automatically filtered from the atmosphere, or simply not finding it fair to be penalized for what your grandfather did, these kind of normative, sometimes very difficult discussions do change the results quite a lot. And then you have scientific questions related to socioeconomic projections, which, yes, do affect the results in terms of GDP and population. But also climate response is sometimes uncertain and based on, if you want to follow Paris, what kind of climate sensitivity do you then choose? And related to that, global strategies, which are also simply choices or interpretations of what you think should be done in light of Paris. So temperature goal, but also negative emissions / overshoot is part of these discussions. So you already see it complexifies the question of fair national emission target more and more. So what we try to do is focus on those latter three. Now, of course, we had to choose a scope, but for these latter three, we try to vary them as much as possible in a systematic way in our paper to try to address questions like this. So how does varying certain assumptions affect the results? And can we also estimate the importance of each assumption? For example, how do you deal with historical emissions? That is important for some countries more than others. So, for example, for Europe, probably it doesn't affect the results qualitatively a lot. But for China, who only started to emit a lot of emissions more recently, it matters a lot how you deal with historical emissions. And we try to map this. That was one of the tasks in the paper. So for example, you get graphs like this. So you basically you see over time you see the coloring, and if for example a large part or in a single year is yellow, that means that the allocation rule, you see that in the legend at the bottom, was a dominant choice, or is a dominant factor in stating what a fair target for the US should be for that year. So you see that all the equity considerations together are completely dominating whatever fair target the US has in 2030. While this is quite different, for example, for China, where you see, indeed, as I just said just now, where the historical starting year and also how you discount historical emissions are very important considerations, together with a couple of the global discussions as well. So that already looks different for China and looks different for India and looks different from Nigeria. I'm not going into too much detail. So we try to simply map this, make transparent what assumption and choice matters for whom. And we generalize this in a very complex graph. I'm only showing it briefly. We can, in the Q&A, maybe go into more detail to somehow sort all equity considerations, all scientific uncertainties, and all global discussions together and map out for every country what matters for what point of time in terms of the fair emission allocations for that particular country. So it's basically a matter or an effort of transparency that we try to do here, so that everybody also in negotiations knows what is important to whom. And then implications, because even though there are so many uncertainties, you can still derive a couple of clear implications. And we do so with the following exercise by saying, what if we now, for every country, take the least stringent out of these three allocation principles? So we have equality, responsibility, and capability. For every country, we take the least stringent, which is basically this bubble diagram that you saw, right? So for the US, it would be equality. And then compare the NDC in 2030. So it was back in the days when 2030 was the NDC targets. You compare the NDC to that least stringent target. And then you get a diagram like this to the left. In red, countries that have insufficient NDCs, so are not ambitious enough, compared to what would be the least stringent fair target for them. And to the right, I have another version where you do not only take the least stringent out of these three allocation rules, but also take across all kinds of assumptions that you can do, even climate targets, so 2 degrees versus 1.6. Take the least stringent across the board. And then still there are a couple of countries that have insufficient ambition, so there's no equity argument for them to be made to argue that their NDC is fair. That was kind of the mirror that we tried to formulate with this diagram. And to the left, main conclusion is that a lot of countries in the global north have insufficient NDCs, at least for 2030, in light of the least stringent fair rule. And we try to then couple this also to what would then be the implications of these fairness rules compared to where mitigation happens. Because do these super stringent targets for the US and Europe then imply that they should do everything domestically? That's actually not what this type of research tries to imply. It mostly tries to imply that they are responsible for that part of mitigation. And you could view it like this. You could try to utilize estimates of what is cost optimal to do in a country. And then if your fair target is indicating that you should do, as a country, it should do more than what it costs optimal to do domestically, that difference, you should then, if you would look at it from a simplistic manner, which is what we did here, that difference should then is then cost economic efficient to invest in mitigation elsewhere. So that is where the finance question, where we will be working on new pathways a lot, comes in. And that is what we try to formulate here. So the red parts are this difference. So where you have deeper fair targets than what is cost optimal to do domestically. Gray is what you can then actually additionally do domestically. And blue is where finance is received. And this is something we try to, as a kind of a final implication result in the paper, quantify here, which is, of course, highly relevant today with the new EU target making things explicit about that they want to invest in mitigation abroad because it is so difficult to do everything domestically. Yeah, that also has an economic um, link, obviously. So that was yeah. I'm wrapping up here. That was it. We have been talking about an update of fair emission targets for countries, the basis of them, but also specifically given quite some attention to yeah the black box between brackets. So how many different choices you can make in this topic, and how it's difficult to be fully comprehensive on this and at the same time say something robust. And at the end, we try to do that anyway. And even throughout the mist of many different uncertainty bars, you can see robust results on is insufficient pledges in the global north, in particular, a couple of countries notably. And the translation of these fair targets towards what would be implications for international finance is, I think, a key question that we try to address a little bit, but we will be researching much more detail in the future. Yeah, one final thing I wanted to mention is that, of course, we were talking about pledges, but that is not talking necessarily about implementation just yet. And so there is also that dimension that that some countries set emissions in a totally different way than other countries. Just wanted to mention that as a kind of a disclaimer. So that's it. Thanks a lot. We have been publishing the results also visually on a web tool, which is called the Carbon Budget Explorer.eu. You see the link over here and a screenshot on the bottom right, where you can set your own global targets and navigate through the results for your particular country according to the different rules that you saw in this presentation. And the paper is also stated here. So that's it. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Mark. Over to you, Nico. Now opening for discussion from Nico.
Yeah, uh, Mark, thank you very much. Yeah, this was the next question I'm sharing. Um, okay, this was the wrong one. What do you see now? As
We see your PowerPoint.
my PowerPoint, very good. And does it now change into the um,
Yes, perfect.
presentation mode? Very good.
No,
So,
this is not presentation mode yet, but this is the
not
presenter.
presentation mode.
I do see presentation mode. Now I don't.
Okay.
It was the presenter mode, but yeah.
Okay, you see now the presentation mode also,
Perfect.
Mark? Okay, wonderful. So thank you very much, Mark. And I mean, the paper is a very good one. And yeah, it's also good that you did not jump now too much into the details because we have updates of NDCs for 2035, and this kind of analysis would now need a update, and there's plenty of work to do. Unfortunately, the results are not very promising for very obvious reasons, but it is, I think, very important to make this transparent and to document this in the scientific literature also that can then be assessed by the corresponding bodies like IPCC. Okay, I mean, basically what Mark does is he looks for a remaining carbon budget and treats it like a cake. Overall remaining carbon budget is consumed over time. and it has to be shared somehow among many nations. And this is a cake sharing problem. And unfortunately, not all nations behave as nicely as a pure top-down approach would suggest, but it's more a bottom-up approach, and we have actors that look a little bit like this. Um, and yeah, probably Christmas cookies would be more season-like, but uh, yeah, um, I leave it with this. Okay, the scientific approach to this, and Mark shows this very nicely in his paper, basically, is we define a carbon budget for a time or a year, 2030 in our case, and then define a burden sharing rule, like equal per capita or the ability to pay or other rules that can be applied. And then usually we define a rule for permit trading. This is the part that Mark was jumping a little over at the very end, but I think it is very important to have this in mind because negotiations always have to consider both at the same time. That you negotiate basically allocation rules and trading rules simultaneously. Um, and you negotiate allocation subject to a perceived permit trading rule. And the default today is very restrictive, or rather no trading. Only in a bloc like the EU you have trading, or something like a climate club. And then in a model, we can then simply investigate all different kinds of economic effects and write very nice papers about it. Political reality is we have a long-term temperature target. However, there's no agreement whatsoever on a burden sharing rule. The trading rules are very restrictive and transfers are also very, yeah, limited. And this basically leads to the necessary policies to be postponed. And this is the global necessary emission reductions that are codified into national laws. This basically means in every COP, in every negotiation round, we don't find a solution, we postpone, the remaining carbon budget is consumed too quickly, and best we can hope for is an overshoot that later generations will solve the problem that we cannot solve today in these negotiations. We also know in the next round that distributional problems are going to be even worsened. And this will not make the solution of the problem easier. What we are currently doing basically is issue linkage to bring more and more topics into the negotiations. And this leads to situations that I hear a carbon brief, debrief of COP30. For 1 hour, the observers discuss about everything but the NDCs. So that was kind of absolutely fascinating to observe because there's so much issue linkage now going on that the most important topic has been completely washed away. And now negotiations become so complex that not even the whole observer team pointed to this issue. So, yeah. Fascinating. Okay, what I find really interesting also on what countries, what is the relationship between ambition and a fair share, and the analysis very nicely points out, so to say, who gets the blame with a methodological background, who are the countries to blame, and we can see also that with Russia and also Saudi Arabia, yeah, it's the fossil fuel exporters. I mean, we have lots of discussions about global north, global south, but this usually leaves the way that there is a few countries that really, really, really profit from fossil fuel trade, and they would have the largest negative consequences to bear. And I would love to see a similar analysis based on the updated NDCs. With this figure, this is at the very end. This is figure 4 in Mark's paper. And basically, this is not fully model-based analysis. Usually, it's a thing that you do with. Uh, your shaking of the head means you agree that it is not. Ah, okay, yeah. So I did not say anything wrong. um, but it shows that there is some countries that are like the US, European Union. We are, so to say, very deeply in a carbon debt, and trading would imply a lot of imports of carbon permits, and that would induce a flow of money into other countries. So this is a conditional transfer because it contains or it is linked to a transfer of emission rights, so money against emission rights. And it is also clear here that India, Nigeria, they would be kind of the profiteers in a sense of the financial flow, not the but they would need to give up then their emission rights. And one of the big problems that we have currently still is the comparisons between trade and no trade usually contain a comparison between complete local consumption or no trade at all, and a fully integrated market with a uniform carbon price. And this would imply really huge transfers between the countries. And I think it is more appropriate to have limited trade or some kind of restrictions, because with a $200 per ton of CO2 carbon price, in Nigeria and India, that would have very, very, very substantial consequences in the near term, and question the feasibility of this strategy. I have also some more questions or comments. Leave out the first one. This is more kind of a methodological one. Mark, I have a question. Has anyone ever looked for the principle of contribution to the solution? For example, technology breakthroughs that are done with the idea to bring in technologies that are beneficial to everybody and reduce CO2 emissions. Think of renewable energies or other. Then negotiations, this sequencing or simultaneity of allocation and trade. So is there something like a way to condition them together so that stricter or more fair allocations are only done if there is more trade? Yeah, because with these super, super strong allocations that you show, a nation state would never ever agree to such allocations without guaranteed trade. Yeah, and that would be interesting. I think we should also look a little more into the interplay between the intertemporal and the intratemporal, also with an equity consideration, because these delays of climate policy, they will also have equity consequences with the damages. And then a question that worries me currently a lot. Can we somehow deviate or move away from a quantity-based sharing rule, bringing in prices or something that we get away from this terrible cake sharing, zero sum negotiation situation that wakes up the worst angels in our politicians. Yeah. Thank you very much, Mark, for the paper and looking forward to the discussion. Thanks.
Thank you, Nico. That's very interesting. Those are very interesting questions. Mark, you want to react?
Yes, yes. Thanks a lot, Nico. And I agree with basically everything you said. So in answer to your question, so the first about the principle of contribution to a solution, and I guess you mean by that that would be maybe one of the corners of this pentagon, like one of the principles by which you do the allocation itself. Um, so in terms of contribution to solution as a right giver to more allocations, I'm not sure whether that's well grounded in any form of environmental law or so. Or I'm trying to think of linkages with fairness principles that I have encountered. But I mean, I do find it interesting, but I'm not sure whether it's addressing the questions of what would be fair to ask of countries, because it could be a country that is maybe relatively rich that somehow has this contribution to a solution, or a country that's relatively poor, then I would wonder whether this contribution to a solution would be the crucial ingredient to give that country more or less. So that would be my take on this. There are many ways in which you can do this allocation, but what we're searching for, and also more and more also with contributions, I mean, you're aware of that from outside our field, is what is now a well-grounded approach in environmental law, or from an ethical point of view, and then acknowledging that there's probably not one answer, but that's kind of leading in the thinking of these principles, rather than thinking of the more technological kind of way. Could you bring up your questions again, maybe?
Nico, you lost Mark.
So
I
I
remember the
try to
last
remember.
question was about not dividing the pie, so
Yeah,
not thinking
yeah.
about a strict budget and trying to divide it in terms of emissions and emissions reductions, but in other metrics.
Yeah, so I already tried to hint towards that in showing some work from others that were making the link much more to distributing investment needs, for example. That's, I think, a very interesting one that may be also kind of the future of this type of work. Um, or really trying to convert in much smarter manners than the simple global carbon price that we did just as kind of a proof of principle in our paper, but making the translation to required finance. But yeah, if you do that, I guess that's the difficulty with one issue you mentioned, the issue linking. Yeah, if you start talking about climate finance, then a lot of other cans of worms may be opened related to, but maybe rightfully so, also, right? Related to finance, related to loss and damage, and finance related to adaptation. So those are a couple of things, specifically the investment needs paper, that I was thinking about in this context. And then on linking allocations and trade. Yeah, I think we're a little bit, in terms of the policy side, in uncharted territory, or little charted territory, when it comes to emission permits and emissions trading. Now that the EU has for 2040 this 5% mitigation abroad, yeah, that's really on a bilateral basis and not on any permit market or so. So yeah, if you ask, have I read or heard a lot about this linkage? Yeah, I acknowledge that it has to be there, but it's not fully out there yet, a lot. So, but I agree. Yeah, and things related to additivity, of course, of mitigation is also something that is related to this. That was, of course, a large concern of a lot of people, when in response to what Hoekstra, the climate commissioner for the EU, was proposing in relation to this mitigation of financing abroad. Well, from our results, you actually see that it's kind of necessary to even get close to fair emission targets, this international finance. But the rules for that, yeah, I agree. And the linkage between allocation and trade, yeah, needs to be detailed out much more. And yeah, I simply agree with your third question on the intertemporal and intratemporal things related to negative emissions and the land that is required for it, things related to overshoot and the impacts related to overshoot. That is all kinds of issue linkages related to this temporal dimension that have a very strong fairness implication, and I can only agree with that. And yeah, as a scientific community, we need to build on that, and at the same time think of what are the relevant issues now. Yeah, with the new reality. Yeah. So that in response.
Thank you very much for your reaction, Mark. Nico, do you want to respond? Anyway, I just want to
Uh,
inform everybody that the Q&A is open. So if you want to open a discussion or just make a clarification question, please go ahead. Nico, if you want to respond, please go ahead.
yeah, I hope that we find lots of opportunities to work on this together in the future. So there's many people, and I think there's even more questions. So I would rather open for them. Uh, so thank you.
There's many people, but there's no question. So maybe I'll make question myself while we wait for the public to to gain courage. My question is related to one of the things you said, Nico, that I think it also takes my sleep away, which is the fact that we are having these damages now, and depending on, of course, which of the emission schemes we may allow, this will have different consequences on the schedule of these damages. So when will these damages kick in the near term, depending on what you're allowing at a given time and how is this trade allowing. And this will have consequences because the losses, so the damages and the need for the need for adaptation will compete with the mitigation. And so this is what I would like you to answer or to try to just comment upon.
Mark?
If you want, and you can, feel free.
I mean, sure. Well, I guess I already mentioned it as I think a couple of times, loss and damage and adaptation being traditionally kind of excluded from this type of work, which on the one hand, yeah, doesn't complexify an already very complex topic even more related to this issue linking. But on the other hand, could be because we're talking about fairness implications of what we're doing, it could be rightfully linked. So there's that. I do not further have a clear opinion, but only the observation that it's missing while in negotiations it's commonly linked. So maybe to be relevant for this type of work to be relevant, they should be linked. And it should be somehow factored in when you take a look at climate funds, for example. Yeah, that's Nico, maybe.
Nick, you'd like to respond, or are you happy with Mark's comments?
Sorry, I forgot to unmute. I mean, the additional pressure, so to say, that you may have also lower growth and therefore less possibilities, and at the same time, more demands for the adaptation needs, rebuilding stuff. And this squeezes your abilities to invest into new technologies and make a transition of your industrial bases and agricultural production systems. This is obviously the case. I mean, the problem is that the policymakers somehow do not feel the pressure. So the shadow of the future does not loom on them today. And this is probably also the task of us to make this shadow of the future really visible. What it if we would taken it serious, what the consequences would need to be. Otherwise, we run into serious problems. And if I look at the current situation with the COP, but also, I mean, in other areas of the of international environmental agreements and negotiations, we have issues at all fronts, like also the plastics agreement and things like this. So currently the times are not very promising to find new targets and new solutions. But rather it is currently a battle to stop the erosion of the system that has been built in the past. And in order to make clear what it means not to act, we have to kind of move the future into the present with modeling studies to make clear what it would mean. And the adaptation need that Lara was referring to is definitely one of these things. Yeah.
Thank you, Nico. Thanks, Mark. We are over we are 2 minutes. We have still 2 minutes, but we have no further questions. So I would leave it as it is. And I would like to really thank both the presenter and the discussant today. And looking forward for the next New Pathways webinar series. You will be informed. It should be around February on the new ambition of the new NDCs. And let's hope that we see some more light than the one we are seeing today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lara, and thank you, Mark.
Likewise. Thank you.